This is the story of Brian, a 50-year-old retired American military officer who lived his life with discipline, structure, and a deep sense of duty. But one day, during what was supposed to be a routine surgery, everything changed. Brian flatlined on the operating table, and for several minutes he was clinically dead. During those moments, he claims to have experienced a near-death journey that transformed his understanding of life, faith, and humanity. Brian says he met Jesus, who revealed truths so profound they could change the world. What he saw and learned will leave you questioning everything you think you know. The day started like any other for Brian. Having recently retired from the military, he was adjusting to civilian life in his quiet suburban neighborhood. Brian was the kind of man who liked routine. A morning coffee, a jog around the block, and a meticulous schedule for his day. He'd spent most of his life serving his country, carrying the weight of responsibility and discipline that came with the uniform. But behind the strong exterior, Brian was carrying a different kind of weight. Memories from his service that haunted him, moments of regret and loss that he rarely shared with anyone. That morning, Brian was preparing for a minor surgery to address a lingering issue in his knee, an injury he had sustained during his time in service. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. The doctors assured him it was a simple procedure, in and out the same day. Brian wasn't worried. After all, he had faced far greater dangers on the battlefield. His wife, Jessica, drove him to the hospital. She held his hand and gave him a reassuring smile as they sat in the waiting room. "You'll be fine," she said. Brian nodded, squeezing her hand back. But as they wheeled him into the operating room, a strange sense of unease washed over him. He couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling, like a storm brewing in the distance. The surgery began without any issues, but midway through, something went wrong. Brian's heart stopped. Alarms blared, nurses scrambled, and the surgeon barked orders to try to revive him. Jessica was ushered into a separate room, tears streaming down her face as she prayed for her husband's life. For Brian, however, everything went silent. The chaos of the operating room faded away, and he found himself in a place he couldn't comprehend. Brian's first sensation was the absence of pain. The constant ache in his knee, the tension in his shoulders, the heaviness in his chest, they were all gone. He felt weightless, almost as if he were floating. Opening his eyes, or whatever he had in this new form, he realized he was no longer in the hospital. He was standing in a vast, endless expanse of light, a glow so warm and pure that it seemed to embrace him. At first, Brian thought he was dreaming. He looked around, trying to find something familiar, but there was nothing. No walls, no ceiling, no floor, just infinite light. Despite the unfamiliarity, he didn't feel afraid. In fact, he felt a peace unlike anything he had ever known. It was as if every worry, every regret, every burden he had carried for 50 years had been lifted. Then he noticed something strange. Below him, he could see the operating room. He saw his own body lying on the table, doctors and nurses working frantically to revive him. "That's me," he thought, but he felt no panic, no urge to return. It was as if he understood, on some deep level, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As he turned his gaze away from the operating room, he felt a presence behind him. It wasn't just a figure. It was a force, an energy so powerful that it filled the entire space. Brian didn't need to see it to know who it was. "Jesus," he whispered, and as he spoke the name, the light around him grew even brighter. Brian turned to face the presence, and there he was. Jesus stood before him, not in a way Brian had seen in paintings or movies, but as a figure of pure love and light. His eyes, though not physical, seemed to look directly into Brian's soul, seeing everything he had ever been and ever would be. Brian felt exposed, yet comforted, as if all his flaws, mistakes, and regrets were laid bare, but met with infinite understanding. "Brian," Jesus said, his voice gentle but firm. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling resonating through every part of Brian's being. "You have carried so much, my son. You fought battles both on and off the field. Now it's time for you to see." Brian didn't know what to say. He felt like a child in the presence of a loving parent, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Jesus reached out his hand, and as Brian took it, a flood of images washed over him. He saw moments from his own life, times he had been brave, selfless, and kind. But he also saw times he had been angry, bitter, and dismissive of others. Each memory was vivid, but there was no judgment in Jesus' eyes, only love. "You've done well in many ways," Jesus said, "but there is more to learn. Let me show you." Suddenly, the light shifted, and Brian was standing in scenes from his past. He saw himself as a young soldier, full of confidence and pride, leading his team through dangerous missions. But he also saw the moments that haunted him, the split-second decisions that cost lives, the times he put duty above compassion. Brian wanted to look away, but Jesus' presence kept him steady. One scene hit Brian the hardest. He saw himself in a war-torn village, refusing to help a family in need because it wasn't part of his mission. He had justified it at the time, but now, standing with Jesus, he saw the pain in their eyes and felt the weight of what his indifference had cost them. "You carried these burdens in silence," Jesus said, "but you don't have to carry them alone anymore." Tears streamed down Brian's face as he felt a wave of forgiveness wash over him. It wasn't just forgiveness from Jesus. It was forgiveness for himself. In that moment, he realized that his past didn't define him. It was part of his journey, but it wasn't the end of the story. Jesus then showed Brian a vision of the future, not just his future, but humanity's. Brian saw people of all nations, races, and backgrounds coming together to solve problems that had once seemed insurmountable. He saw communities rebuilding after disasters, not as isolated groups, but as global neighbors united by compassion. Brian saw children leading movements for change, their voices inspiring adults to act. He saw innovations in technology that were used not for profit, but to heal the planet and feed the hungry. He saw soldiers laying down their weapons, shaking hands with those they once called enemies. "This is what's possible," Jesus said, "when love leads the way." Brian felt a surge of hope. For the first time in years, he believed that the world could be better, not through power or force, but through unity and understanding. He realized that his own life, his experiences, could play a role in making that vision a reality. As Brian stood in awe of the visions unfolding before him, Jesus turned his attention to the role America could play in shaping the future. Brian saw scenes of his country, not as a place of division or conflict, but as a guiding light for the world. America has the potential to lead, Jesus said, but leadership must come through humility, compassion, and the strength to unite, not divide. Brian saw images of Americans coming together in ways that transcended political, racial, and cultural differences. He witnessed farmers, teachers, scientists, and factory workers collaborating to rebuild communities. He saw leaders at all levels of government prioritizing people over power, ensuring everyone had access to education, healthcare, and opportunities. Jesus revealed a vision of America taking the lead in global initiatives, working with other nations to combat climate change, eradicate hunger, and develop clean energy. Brian saw American scientists sharing their discoveries with the world, not for profit, but for the common good. He saw American soldiers returning home, using their discipline and training to mentor young people and strengthen communities. But Jesus also showed Brian the dangers of failing to rise to this potential. He saw a divided nation, where mistrust and hatred weakened the very fabric of society. "The choice is always yours," Jesus said, "to lead with love or to fall to fear. The world is watching." Brian felt a renewed sense of pride in his country, but it wasn't the pride of power. It was the pride of knowing what was possible when people came together for a greater purpose. The next vision Jesus shared was one of forgiveness. Brian was taken to a small, intimate scene. A father and son sitting on a porch, the tension between them thick with years of misunderstanding. As Brian watched, the son finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, tears in his eyes. The father hesitated, his pride and pain holding him back. But then, slowly, he reached out and embraced his son. Both men wept, their burdens lifted in that moment of reconciliation. "This is the power of forgiveness," Jesus said. "It heals not just the heart, but the world." Brian saw forgiveness ripple outward in ways he never expected. Families torn apart by anger began to rebuild their bonds. Communities divided by hate started to heal through dialogue and understanding. Even on a global scale, Brian saw nations reconciling, ending conflicts that had lasted for generations. The most profound moment came when Jesus turned the lesson back on Brian. He showed Brian faces from his past, people he had wronged, intentionally or not. A young man Brian had dismissed during his military service, a colleague he had been harsh with, even strangers he had ignored when they needed help. "It's never too late to seek forgiveness," Jesus said, "but forgiveness begins with yourself." Brian felt an immense weight lift from his soul. For years, he had carried guilt and regret like a heavy pack on his back. Now, in this moment, he understood that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant freeing himself to move forward with love and purpose. Jesus then turned to one of Brian's deepest struggles, his military trauma. For years, Brian had carried the invisible scars of war, the faces of comrades he had lost, the decisions he had made under pressure, the moments that haunted his dreams. He had buried these feelings deep, masking them with stoicism and routine. In the vision, Brian saw himself sitting with other veterans, sharing stories of pain and resilience. He saw men and women, once hardened by their experiences, finding solace in each other's company. Jesus showed him how acknowledging his pain and seeking help could not only heal himself, but inspire others to do the same. "Trauma doesn't define you," Jesus said. "It's a part of your story, but it's not the end. Healing comes when you let others in." Brian was shown ways he could use his experiences to make a difference. He saw himself mentoring younger veterans, helping them navigate the transition to civilian life. He saw himself speaking openly about his struggles, breaking the stigma around mental health in the military. He even saw himself organizing community events where veterans and civilians could connect, fostering understanding and support. For the first time, Brian felt that his pain had a purpose, not as something to hide, but as a tool to help others heal. Next, Jesus showed Brian the incredible impact of small acts of kindness. The vision began with a simple scene: a woman helping an elderly man carry groceries to his car. It was an ordinary moment, the kind of thing most people wouldn't think twice about. But as the vision expanded, Brian saw how that single act set off a chain reaction. The elderly man, inspired by the woman's kindness, decided to bake cookies for his neighbor, a single mother struggling to make ends meet. That neighbor, feeling uplifted, volunteered at her son's school, helping other kids with reading. One of those kids grew up to become a teacher who inspired hundreds of students to pursue their dreams. "This is the ripple effect," Jesus said. "Kindness spreads in ways you cannot see, but it always makes a difference." Brian felt a pang of guilt as he thought about the times he had brushed off opportunities to help others. But Jesus reminded him that it was never too late to start. He showed Brian how even the smallest gestures, a smile, a word of encouragement, a helping hand, could change lives in ways Brian might never know. The final vision in this part of Brian's journey was one of war and peace. Jesus showed Brian the cost of conflict, not just in lives lost, but in the spiritual toll it took on humanity. He saw soldiers on both sides of battles, their faces etched with fear and sorrow. He saw families torn apart, communities destroyed, and opportunities lost to the chaos of violence. But then the vision shifted. Brian saw what could happen when humanity chose peace. Nations came together to negotiate. Leaders put aside their egos, and soldiers returned home not to fight, but to rebuild. He saw schools rising where bombs had once fallen, fields flourishing where there had been nothing but rubble. War may sometimes seem inevitable, Jesus said, but peace is always possible. It requires courage, not the courage to fight, but the courage to forgive, to listen, and to seek understanding. Brian felt a deep sense of responsibility. As a former soldier, he understood the cost of war better than most. He realized that his mission wasn't over. It had simply changed. His new battle was one of building bridges, spreading understanding, and being a voice for peace. Jesus then turned Brian's attention to the dangers of division, a recurring theme that had haunted humanity throughout history. Brian was shown a vision of a community torn apart, not by war, but by mistrust and misunderstanding. Neighbors who once shared meals and laughter now avoided one another. Social media was flooded with hateful arguments, and families sat in silence at dinner tables, unable to bridge their differences. This is what happens when division is allowed to grow unchecked, Jesus said. It starts small, a careless word, an unchecked bias, but it spreads like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Brian saw how division weakened societies. Communities that once thrived became fractured, their strength drained by internal conflict. People stopped seeing each other as human, focusing instead on their differences. The Spirit revealed how this division wasn't just a modern problem. It had been present in every era, eroding trust and progress. But then, Jesus showed Brian the antidote: dialogue, empathy, and a willingness to listen. Brian saw people sitting down with those they disagreed with, not to argue, but to understand. He saw communities coming together to celebrate their shared humanity, finding strength in their diversity. Division can be healed, Jesus said, but it takes effort. Love must be stronger than fear. Brian felt the weight of this message. He understood that division wasn't just a problem for governments or leaders to solve. It was something every individual had the power to address in their own lives. The next vision took Brian to the heart of what Jesus called the foundation of society: families and communities. Brian saw a small, tight-knit family gathered around a dinner table, laughing and sharing stories. The scene was simple, but the love and connection in that room were palpable. This is where it begins, Jesus said. Strong families build strong communities. Strong communities build a better world. Brian was then shown families who struggled to connect, parents too busy to listen, children lost in their devices, and tensions that simmered beneath the surface. These families weren't broken, but they were disconnected. Jesus revealed how small, intentional actions, like eating meals together, having honest conversations, and prioritizing time with loved ones, could heal these rifts. The vision expanded to show entire communities. Brian saw neighbors helping one another, sharing resources, and coming together to solve problems. He witnessed towns organizing food drives, creating mentorship programs for youth, and supporting local businesses. In one powerful image, Brian saw a community rebuilding a home for a family who had lost everything in a fire. It was a testament to the power of unity. Jesus emphasized that families and communities were the building blocks of a better world. When you strengthen these bonds, he said, you create a ripple effect that reaches far beyond what you can see. Brian's next vision focused on the role of technology in shaping the future. He was shown two possible paths, one where technology was used to divide and control, and another where it was harnessed to unite and uplift. In the first vision, Brian saw people consumed by their screens, disconnected from the world around them. Social media became a breeding ground for hate and misinformation, deepening divisions and eroding trust. Technology was used to exploit, to manipulate, and to create barriers between people. But the second vision was vastly different. Brian saw technology used as a tool for connection and progress. He witnessed farmers using advanced equipment to grow food sustainably, ensuring that no one went hungry. He saw doctors using cutting-edge innovations to heal diseases and extend lives. He even saw students from different parts of the world learning together through virtual classrooms, breaking down cultural barriers and fostering understanding. Technology is neither good nor evil, Jesus said. It is a tool. Its impact depends on how humanity chooses to use it. Brian felt a deep sense of hope as he watched people using technology to solve problems and bring communities closer together. He realized that the future wasn't about rejecting progress. It was about ensuring that progress served the greater good. Jesus then gave Brian a glimpse of America's future, a vision that was both sobering and inspiring. At first, Brian saw a nation struggling with its identity, torn between its past and its potential. There were protests, debates, and moments of tension, but there was also a spark of hope. He saw leaders emerging who prioritized unity over division, compassion over power. These leaders weren't perfect, but they listened to the people and worked tirelessly to bridge divides. Brian saw small towns thriving again, with local businesses flourishing and communities coming together to support one another. In this vision, Brian also saw ordinary people stepping up to make a difference. Teachers inspired their students to dream big. Farmers adopted sustainable practices that protected the environment. Veterans like Brian used their experiences to mentor and guide younger generations. It was a future where everyone played a role in building a better nation. This is what America can be, Jesus said, a beacon of hope, not through power, but through love, service, and unity. Brian felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that the future wasn't set in stone. It was shaped by the choices people made every day. Finally, Jesus showed Brian the unique role veterans could play in creating a better world. Brian saw himself and others like him using their discipline, leadership, and resilience to inspire change. Veterans weren't just soldiers. They were mentors, teachers, and community leaders. In one vision, Brian saw a group of veterans working with at-risk youth, teaching them skills like teamwork, discipline, and perseverance. These young people, once lost and struggling, found purpose and confidence through the guidance of their mentors. Another vision showed veterans organizing community events, fostering connections between civilians and former service members. They shared stories, broke down stereotypes, and reminded people of the sacrifices made for freedom. Your service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, Jesus said. It evolves. Use your experiences to build, to teach, and to heal. Brian felt a deep sense of responsibility. He understood that his time in the military wasn't just about the past. It was a foundation for the work he was meant to do in the future. Jesus then gave Brian a sobering vision of what could happen if humanity grew complacent. Brian saw a world where people stopped striving for unity and progress, where the seeds of division and neglect were allowed to grow unchecked. Communities that had once been vibrant became fractured. Families drifted apart, consumed by distractions and indifference. Leaders no longer prioritized the common good, and instead focused on their own interests. The images were haunting. Brian saw neglected neighborhoods, barren fields where crops once thrived, and people turning away from one another in times of need. Jesus explained that progress was not a one-time achievement. It required constant care and vigilance. This is what happens when people forget their purpose, Jesus said. Complacency is the enemy of growth. Brian was then shown how small acts of carelessness could escalate. A lack of empathy in families rippled outward, weakening entire communities. Mistrust between nations grew into conflicts that could have been avoided. It was a reminder that even small choices mattered. But Jesus also revealed hope. Brian saw people recognizing their mistakes and taking steps to course correct. He saw families reconnecting, communities rebuilding, and nations working together to restore what was lost. The lesson was clear. While complacency could lead to destruction, it was never too late to choose a different path. The next vision focused on the transformative power of education and open dialogue. Brian was shown classrooms filled with children learning not just academics, but also the values of empathy, collaboration, and critical thinking. Teachers encouraged students to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and explore different perspectives. Brian saw a young boy who had been struggling in school because of a difficult home life. A teacher noticed his struggles and took the time to mentor him, showing him patience and kindness. That boy grew up to become a community leader, using his own experiences to uplift others. In another vision, Brian saw town hall meetings where people from opposing viewpoints came together to have honest conversations. At first, the discussions were tense, but over time, as people began to listen to one another, the tension gave way to understanding. Brian realized that dialogue didn't mean everyone had to agree. It was about creating space for empathy and mutual respect. Jesus explained, "Education is not just about knowledge. It's about learning how to see each other as human beings." Brian felt inspired. He saw how teaching these values to children and practicing them as adults could create a ripple effect, transforming entire communities. He realized that true progress came not from avoiding difficult conversations, but from embracing them with an open heart.